so the power of education is so controlled that even the legislators who write the laws don't push for education to become a profession. I tried as hard as I could, because the research shows that regardless to what the parents think, for the average African American, it's the teacher's decision in terms of that child's educational future, because they're the ones who write the grades. They're the ones who fill out the forms for college. They're the ones who fill out the data for the specialized high schools. It's not the parent. So the parent has to have profoundly strong belief system. So I saw teachers change the records of students so that they would not be eligible to go out. Because you see, I shared a classroom with another teacher. I was there in the morning, she was there in the afternoon. Or I hear them talking in the lunchroom. And I realize that even a chance for them to get a better education is being sabotaged.
Culture is a critical component of any learning environment. There can be no excellence without cultural excellence, are the words of Dr. Adelaide Sanford. She spoke passionately about the importance of including African and African American history and culture in the classroom. The curriculum of inclusion is necessary to build the child's self-esteem, which is a pillar in the academic success of a child. Dr. Sanford has dedicated her life to transforming lives in a Bedford-Stuyvesant school to reforming the educational system statewide in New York. Over the 50 years, Dr. Sanford has had a profound impact on thousands of lives of students, educators, and leaders throughout the country. Her legacy is to be remembered with those great educational trailblazers like Drs. Carter G. Woodson, Benjamin Mays, Joseph Ben Yakinen, John Henrik Clark, Mary McLeod Bethune, Asa Hillard, Louis Henry Gates, Jawanza Kunjufu, Leonard Jeffries, Shasi McIntyre, and many others.
She is the elder in our community, and she is the wisest. She's the most thoughtful, most respected, and she's our leader. So we call her Queen Mother.
Fortunately, I was a very inquisitive child, and so I was always full of questions. I wanted my grandmother to tell me what her life was like. She was sold with her mother in Charleston, South Carolina, when they landed in the New World. It wasn't unusual for plantation owners who lived isolated to try to buy a woman with a child same age as the plantation owner's child. And so that was the arrangement. My mother was sold to this family that had a daughter about my grandmother's age. They were further sold to a couple in Mississippi, Poplar Hill, Mississippi. But my grandmother knew her mother. However, because of the nature of chattel slavery, we were never allowed to bond with anyone who spoke the same language. So even on the plantation, while there might have been several people of African ancestry. They did not come from the same nation or the same language group. That was done intentionally. So even though my grandmother and her mother were sold together, they were not always allowed to be together. And so my grandmother told me several stories, but the two that I remember most strongly, because I think it still affects us today, was that whenever they were working in the kitchen or the laundry or cleaning, whatever it was that they were doing, and the little black children would come around them, they would always embrace them and nurture them and cuddle them to the extent that they could. But if Ole Miss came in, they would shove those children away. Get on away, you're in my way, get away. Because they knew that if Ole Miss saw any bonding, they would immediately be separated. And so the conflict in the child's mind, that one minute you're embracing me and validating me, and the next minute, under certain circumstances, you shove me away. And you don't have an opportunity to explain that that's a survival technique. And so that child could very well be quite confused about that relationship that is at one time one way and another time another way. It doesn't allow you to trust and to build confidence. And I think I remember that story particularly because I think that's still true, that that whole chattel slave experience has so damaged our ability to express affection and to cuddle and to nurture, because you put those two things together, that means separation. The other, one of the many stories that she told me that resonate with me, and there's so many, was the fact that when the teacher would come for Ole Miss, my grandmother would roll under the teaster bed. You know, a teaster bed is high off the floor. You have to step up on a step stool to get in. She'd roll underneath there, and she would listen to what the teacher and little Miss, they called, were doing. And when they left, she'd roll from under the bed, get the book, and try to find it. So she taught herself to read like that. And she could quote scripture, she could quote Shakespeare. We have an innate ability to remember things, particularly words. That was a survival skill. And very often when teachers would talk about the difficulty in teaching children to read, children can teach themselves to read if they're motivated. Now, what's the example of that? You give a 3-year-old a little game that he works with his fingers, where he gets immediate response. You don't have to teach him. You don't have to send him to remedial classes. The kids pick up that technology automatically because it's something that feeds back to them and it's of interest to them. And I often think about that. And that was one of the strategies that I used when I was a teacher, was that you don't expect a child to come to school motivated to learn Shakespeare. They're motivated to read. Now, if you want him to learn Shakespeare, then you've got to make Shakespeare real for him. You can't just assume that because you think he was wonderful, the children will think he was wonderful. That's the same thing when I did teaching with adults. They would give you all kinds of program materials and copybooks that you would use. They weren't interested in that. I would tell them, bring me something that you want to read. Old letters, the Bible. Sometimes in the Bible were the names of who was born and who. That's what they wanted to read. And that motivated them to read. And then later on, you could get them to the rest of it. But those are the things that I remember. And the other story that I remember so well is my grandmother said that when the vessels left West Africa, very often the slave ships had black men, Africans, who manned the ships. They weren't in charge, but they worked the slave ships. And again, very often they were not of the same language group as the enslaved people that were the cargo of the ship. And very often when they would find where they were taking the Africans, they wouldn't go back again. But there were some who did. And they worked in their minds some way to help these desperate people who were being taken away from everything and everyone that they knew and loved and didn't know where they were going or what their future would be. They had no baggage, no luggage, nothing. So when you go to Ellis Island, you see all these things that people brought with them. Our people brought nothing, but they had hair. And so some of the Africans, men who worked the slave ship, they would take okra seeds, which are very small, and yam tubers, that's that little vein, the root, and they would slip it to the person who was going to be enslaved. They couldn't talk to them. They couldn't tell them. But in our ability to transfer meaning without words, it was as though they said, I know you can't go home. I know I can't take you back. I don't know what your life will be. But if you take this and plant it, it will give you strength. It will give you energy. And it will remind you that even though we couldn't help you, we cared about you. And they took those okra seeds and yam tubers, and they're medicinal. Both of them are medicinal. In fact, they have extracted something from the yam, that original yam, that's very good for high blood pressure. And there are people today who come from Africa who will tell you that if you're sick, you need okra soup because of the medicinal qualities. So that said to me that regardless to the circumstances in which we find ourselves, and in the school system over the years that I served on the Board of Regents, when I went to schools where the children didn't have books, where the teachers didn't care about them, where their parents didn't know how to make the system work. And they would ask me, they would tell me, say, well, we don't have books enough. Or they would say, we don't have a lab and we have to take the Regents bio. And I couldn't help them. Even though I was a Regent, I didn't have the capacity to help them. But I was always aware of the fact that I had to leave something for them that would give them hope and give them strength and give them courage and help them to grow up to change their conditions. And that's why I wear beads in my hair. 2. One is okra seeds and one is yam tubers, to let me never forget that you always find some word, some touch, some expression that the person understands that says, I care about you. My mother is from Mississippi, Vicksburg, Mississippi. And my father was from Cincinnati, Ohio. They met because my uncle by marriage was a sailor, was in the Navy, and my father was in the Navy. And that Uncle Lester, and my father met in France. When the war was over, and they came back to the States, he invited my father to Vicksburg, where he lived. And that's where my parents met. He was born in Brooklyn, New York. At a time when the Depression was at its height. So it was very difficult for our people to make a living. So I am very conscious of that still. And when I think about the fact that today, still with such high unemployment among our people, even though the unemployment rate may say 5%, if you disaggregate it, you will find that even that long ago, there was a problem of employment for our people, and there still is. But I was born in Brooklyn, New York. Graduated was valedictorian in middle school. I went on to Brooklyn College, which was built by the WPA at that time. All you had to do was have a nickel car fare. There was no tuition. Today, tuition is like $3,000 and $4,000. No tuition. You had to buy your own books, you could buy them used, or you could try to get them from the library. And I graduated from Brooklyn College. Then I went to Columbia for a while because I wasn't old enough to teach. My mother was a dressmaker, and she had a customer who was Emmanuel Seller's wife. Emmanuel Seller was the congressman from our district. And his daughter was a graduate of Wellesley. And they were looking for some young Black women to come to Wellesley to the graduate school on a scholarship. But they wanted to make sure that they would succeed. So they would only take you if you were already in graduate school so that they knew you could do well. And she wanted to submit my name, and I was accepted to Wellesley. And I got a master's of law. Teaching in 1950, I was at PS 28 in Brooklyn, which is on Herkimer Street. In 1956, Crispus Attucks opened as a brand new school, and I transferred to that school. So I was there from its inception until 1985 when I retired. So Crispus Attucks was built to serve a housing project, the Brevoort houses. But at that time, families had larger numbers of children. So the school was too small to give a full day to all of the children who came. So the school was opened on a half day for all the children from kindergarten through grade 6. I was a teacher there. Alice Uzaga and I came there together. And it was a unique experience, more different from the experience at 28, in that every male of European background who taught there was there temporarily until they could take the next exam. So a lot of the scheduling for who would come for the first part of the day, would teach the first half, who would teach the second half, was always built around their schedule so that they had time to study and could pass the exams. There was never anything posted of when the exams were given. We knew that there were cram courses. The principal was actually an acting principal. We didn't know that at the time because they didn't label them acting until Black people began to be acting principals. She was a physical ed person. She really didn't know a lot about curriculum, but that wasn't the agenda. The agenda was, here you have a brand new school. It's on half-time. It's a good place for teachers to be comfortable because really there was very little that was required of them. And it was the same way at 28. The principal of the school told me, just keep them in the classroom, keep them quiet. Don't let them run up and down the hall. But there were, at the time that I went, 3 Black teachers came at that same time. And we could see that how could these children make it? Half day, at the basic time when you're going to have to learn the fundamentals of education. But we couldn't do anything about that at that time. One of the defining moments was when the integration came about and children who were in underserved schools in Flatbush and different parts of the city had to accept children from overutilized school buildings. And those children were Black, and they would be bused to these white schools. But if the child from the overserved school, overutilized school, had any problems with reading, with attendance, health, they weren't eligible. So I saw teachers change the records of students so that they would not be eligible to go up. Because you see, I shared a classroom with another teacher. I was there in the morning, she was there in the afternoon. But I hear them talking in the lunchroom. And I realized that even a chance for them to get a better education is being sabotaged. And it was at that point that I, with Alice Uzaga and with a couple of other teachers, decided that we were going to take the exam. We didn't take a cram course. We didn't even know that they were prepared to. We passed the exam. Now, when we passed the exam, what happened When vacancies became available for assistant principals, we were never selected. And the principal, I still have the letter, wrote to me saying, I know that you have passed the exam and your time will come, but I'm going to appoint Marie Sparks. And she appointed a European woman who hadn't taken the exam, didn't have the credentials. Now, when that woman was appointed, she already had on her record having told the children when they raised their hand to go to the bathroom, eeny, meeny, miny, mo, catch a you-know-who by the tail. That's how she made her decisions. So she was known for that. The parents had tried to raise some concern, but nothing happened. That's the person that she made the assistant principal. And that's when the principal became ill. Shortly after that, we had an annex, the whole PS 70, which is now a very, very prominent school. That was the annex because the children were on a half day. We had tried to do something about that. They gave us this annex. The principal got sick. She didn't want to send the white AP because she knew they couldn't handle it. So she sent me. So I went over there as a teacher in charge, cleaned up the school, bought flowers and curtains, and the secretary wrote to the principal, who was home ill, saying, something's happening. People are beginning to look to her. Then there was an in-service course, and I was asked to teach reading, how to teach reading. I used the book from the Board of Ed about using an experience chart, writing down what the children say. And one of the teachers there from another school said, you're being an apologist. These children are not deprived. They are depraved. She said her people came to this country. They had nothing, and they worked hard and sacrificed, and look where they are. So I had to point out to her the difference, that they came and benefited from what the slaves had done, and that she felt her parents had done so well. I said, you're a teacher and I'm a teacher. So whatever your parents did and gave you, when you say they were so wonderful, how come you're doing the same thing I'm doing? And my parents said nothing. Well, that hit me bad, that I had insulted these teachers. Not counting the fact that she had said that our children were depraved. That didn't matter. So that was the beginning of the end. Teachers left the school. The principal left the school. They sent all kinds of, they closed the annex. They put portables up. And that's when the war began. And the decision on the part of the 2 or 3 Black teachers were that when I was asked to apologize for the statement that I made in terms of the difference between what this teacher's parents had been able to use and keep their money and put it in the Swiss banks and become whoever they wanted to become, I had to apologize, but they didn't. And I would not apologize. So the principal and several teachers were transferred, and they kept sending in other people. Ambulances were there every day. The fire department was there every day. Now, I'm still in the classroom at that time. It was the parents who came to me and asked me that if they petitioned, could I become an assistant principal? Well, they didn't win, but they sent a Black principal, woman. We didn't know that she was told if she would just stay 2 years, she could become a superintendent. She selected me as the assistant principal, and we began to whip that school into shape. When she left in 2 years, I didn't know she was leaving. I just came and found it. That's when I became principal, at the request of the parents. That's when things started to turn around. We wrote a petition to get a new wing on the building, which we won, so the kids didn't have to have part-time. We taught ethnic studies. We had music, and that was the beginning of the emergence of 21. And every teacher who came, many of them who came, were not fully licensed. I said, if you're a good person and you care about these children and you respect these parents, I'll see that you pass the exam. So I taught them how to pass the exam. And many of the teachers who came, who were African American, who didn't have a license, were licensed while they were there. And some of them stayed through the years that I was there and eventually became assistant principal and principal. And then they followed that. But it took from 1956 when I went there to 1985 when I retired to bring that change about. We taught the parents how to deal with the school board. Now, the school board at that point was almost all Black. But they intimidated the parents. They wouldn't let them ask questions. So we taught them Robert's Rules of Order so that they knew what the procedure was in a meeting so that they could not be put down, and they taught them how to read a budget. So they became articulate and became our best support system. And that's why almost every Black regent, while I was there, didn't stay longer than 2 or 3 years because the racism was so obvious, so subtle, and at the same time so blatant. When you go to the check-in, when you get to Albany and you go into the hotel where you're going to stay because we'd be there 2 nights, and then we're lined up together because we all came on the same van. They don't ask for credentials until it comes to me. Now, a lot of Black men who were on the board, they didn't put up. It was too humiliating. But I stayed 21 years. No salary, no telephone, no office, So we had very wealthy white people who were on that board. But our people, it was a sacrifice for me. So it is the most powerful educational entity in the United States. Now, all education is a state function. It's a states' rights function. That's why the South could maintain its privilege so long, because it's states' rights. So when you look at the control that the Board of Regents has and the Regents' exams, and then all the money that comes from the federal government goes to the state. The federal government doesn't distribute that money. It goes to the state, and the state distributes the money. Now, when the Black caucus was strong, they are the ones who developed SEEK and EHOP and college discovery. It didn't come from the Board of Regents. It came from the legislators, the Black legislators. But when it became law, then it's given to the regents to implement. Well, I was in Kenya at the time, and I got this call from my daughter that Vernon Mason, Donald Smith, and Sheila Evans Training wanted to submit my name as a candidate for chancellor. Now, I knew that it wasn't going to happen, but I felt, well, maybe I'll have a chance to talk about my point of view, because you will have open forums with people who are candidates. So from Kenya, I said, okay, go ahead, do what you have to do. And I remember this one woman wrote an article. She was with the animals, and they asked her if she would be a chancellor. Can you imagine? Isn't that ridiculous? As though, say, I went home to be with the animals. But it was interesting. There was never any likelihood, but it brought a lot of public exposure. I think it was Bernard Gifford who became chancellor at that time. Or Richard Green. Richard Green, I think it was. They figured they better go find somebody. And but I never took it seriously. But I did become Vice-Chancellor of the Board of Regents. That was by vote of the regents themselves, which was a miracle. First time in the history of the Board of Regents, which is more than 200 years old, that a person who was Vice-Chancellor didn't become Chancellor. First time. Now, what expedited that? It's a Black woman writing for the Daily News. She wrote a column saying that if this woman becomes Chancellor, the regents will be given in Ebonics. Black woman. Now, the regents weren't going to vote for me to be chancellor anyway, but see, they gave me an excuse. They said, oh, well, this woman must know she's a newspaper writer and Sanford is active in New York. We had never even discussed Ebonics at the Board of Regents. But that went all over. I still have the newspaper articles. So 2 years more I had as regent, but I didn't have 2 years more as vice-chancellor. I had 2 terms. I had 6 years as vice-chancellor. And they didn't elect me as vice-chancellor to become the chancellor. And I wasn't sure that they would re-elect me as vice-chancellor. And I wanted to go out as the first Black vice-chancellor. So I decided to leave, and I had 2 years left on my term.
She's one of the greatest educators that we have. I met Dr. Adelaide Sanford at the First World Alliance, which was an organization that met every week, and the focus was on culture of African people, the continent, the history, the present, all of that. One day, Dr. Sanford came in, and she had met the people who put it together. What is the sister's name? I forgot her name. But she came with a wealth of experience. She was a teacher. She was the principal of a school. And she made sure that the focus of the classes, the lessons, the curriculum was on a positive approach to who we are as a people. There was no chucking and jiving. There was no scratching of the heads. There was no silliness about it. And whenever she came to speak, she brought that with her.
Dr. Sanford tried her best to help change the system, to educate each and every child. She gave them wisdom, love, and a smile. It's up to you now to continue her fight. It's your time. It's your hour. The best advice she can give you is knowledge is power.
Knowledge is power. You can't do much if you don't even know the source of the power. And that's what bothered me all the years I was on the Board of Regents, the effort to try to get our people to understand the Board of Regents. And even though the region for your judicial district may be white, they still should represent your point of view, and you should know who they are, and you should be calling on them and writing to them. It wasn't successful. We wouldn't have an Asian regent from Queens, and the majority of Queens is not Asian. I have nothing against the person. I don't know her. But I resent the fact that our people don't use the power that they have.